spent 11 years as an Alaska state trooper in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley before that February night near Palmer. Most people do not realize how the permafrost up here makes certain things possible that should not be possible. The cold preserves things, organic matter, structures, evidence. But what I found that winter proved something far more disturbing. Someone had learned to use our frozen ground as a weapon. The call came through dispatch around 2:17 in the morning. A wellness check requested by a social worker who had been unable to reach the Morrison family for 3 days straight. The address put them about 40 miles outside Palmer, one of those isolated homesteads that dot the valley where your nearest neighbor might be 2 miles away through dense timber and snow. February in Alaska means temperatures hovering around -15, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache with each breath and turns any moisture in the air into tiny ice crystals that catch the light like suspended diamonds. My partner that night was a younger trooper named Rachel Simmons, only in her second year with the department but sharp as they come. We took the state highway north, our cruiser, cutting through darkness so complete it felt like driving through a void. The only illumination came from our headlights, reflecting off snowbanks piled 8 feet high on either side of the road. Rachel kept checking the GPS coordinates, while I navigated the increasingly narrow access roads that branched off into private property. The Morrison homestead sat at the end of a half-mile driveway that had not been plowed in at least 3 days based on the snow accumulation. We had to park at the main road and hike in, our boots crunching through knee-deep powder while our flashlights swept across the silent landscape. The house itself was a modest 2-story structure with a metal roof and that weathered look that all buildings get after enduring decades of Alaskan winters. What struck me immediately was that every light in the house was on. Every single window glowed against the darkness, but there was no movement visible anywhere. No shadows passing by curtains, no flicker of a television screen. Rachel radioed our position to dispatch while I approached the front door. The porch boards creaked under my weight despite the cold, and I could see my breath hanging in the air like smoke. I knocked loudly, announcing ourselves as state police. But the house gave back only silence. The door was unlocked, which itself was unusual. People out here learned quickly that unlocked doors in winter could mean frozen pipes if wind blew through, or worse, attracting wildlife looking for warmth. The interior was warm, almost stifling compared to the bitter cold outside. The thermostat was cranked up to 78 degrees, and I could hear the furnace running in the basement. The living room looked recently occupied. Coffee cups sat on the end table next to an open magazine, reading glasses perched on the arm of a worn recliner, and a knitting project lay abandoned mid-row on the couch. In the kitchen, I found 4 place settings arranged at the table with dried-out food still on the plates. Spaghetti, based on the congealed red sauce, probably 3 or 4 days old. A pot sat on the stove with more of the same, covered in a thin film. Rachel checked the upstairs while I searched the main floor. She called down that the beds were unmade. Clothes were laid out like people had been planning to get dressed, but no sign of the family anywhere. David Morrison, his wife Catherine, and their 2 teenage sons, Marcus and Ian, had simply vanished from their home mid-routine. The bathroom showed toothbrushes still wet in the holder, towels damp and hanging crooked on the racks. Someone had been here recently, very recently, but where had they gone? That is when I noticed the basement door standing partially open. Most people keep basement doors closed in winter to contain heat, so the fact that it was ajar immediately drew my attention. I descended the wooden stairs slowly, my hand resting on my weapon more from instinct than any specific threat. The basement was finished, converted into a family room with a large television, gaming consoles, and a sectional couch. Posters of sports teams and bands covered the walls, clearly the domain of teenage boys. But what made my blood run cold was the floor. The concrete foundation had a massive hole carved into it, roughly 6 feet in diameter, with a wooden ladder descending into darkness below. The edges of the hole showed fresh tool marks, and I could see piles of broken concrete and displaced dirt stacked neatly against the far wall. Someone had been digging here for weeks, maybe months, creating an excavation directly beneath the house that should not exist. I shined my flashlight down into the opening and saw that the ladder dropped at least 15 feet before reaching what looked like a tunnel floor carved from permafrost. I radioed for backup and specialized units immediately. Something about this scene screamed wrongness on every level. Rachel joined me in the basement, and we both stared into that hole while we waited. The temperature rising from below was noticeably colder than the basement itself, and I could smell earth and something else, something chemical and sharp that I could not identify. Within 40 minutes, we had 4 additional units on scene, along with a search and rescue team equipped with proper gear for underground exploration. Sergeant Hayes made the call that we would descend as a team of 4, leaving 2 troopers to secure the scene above. I volunteered to go first, followed by Rachel, Hayes, and a trooper named Connor who had caving experience. The latter was sturdy, professionally constructed from treated lumber, and descended into a chamber that opened up significantly once you reached the bottom. What we found down there defied every expectation I had built up during the descent. The tunnel system was extensive, hand-carved through permafrost with incredible precision. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and lined with what looked like transparent sheeting to prevent thawing. LED strip lighting had been installed along the ceiling, currently off but wired to a generator we could hear humming somewhere deeper in the complex. The main tunnel split into multiple branches, each marked with crude symbols scratched into the ice. We chose the largest passage and followed it for approximately 50 yards before it opened into a chamber roughly the size of a double garage. The chamber had been modified into a living space of sorts. Military cots lined one wall, each with sleeping bags and personal items scattered on top. A camping stove sat on a folding table, surrounded by empty food containers and bottled water. But what dominated the room was the far wall, which had been carved into a series of cells, 6 separate spaces, each about 4 feet wide and 7 feet deep, separated by walls of reinforced ice and closed off with heavy metal gates that looked like they had been scavenged from a prison renovation. 4 of the cells were empty, 2 contained people. We found David Morrison in the first occupied cell, huddled in the corner with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looked up when our flashlights hit him, and the expression on his face was pure terror, mixed with something else. Relief, maybe, or disbelief. In the cell next to him was a woman I did not recognize, probably in her mid-40s, wearing clothes that looked like they had not been changed in weeks. Both of them started crying when they saw our uniforms, trying to speak, but their words coming out in incomprehensible bursts. Rachel immediately began working on the cell gates, while I called for medical assistance and tried to calm David enough to get coherent information. Between sobs, he managed to explain that a man had taken them 5 days ago. The man had come to their door late at night claiming his truck had broken down and he needed to use their phone. The moment David opened the door, the man had deployed some kind of chemical spray that incapacitated the entire family within seconds. When they woke up, they were down here in these cells. The woman in the other cell was named Patricia Hendricks, and she had been missing for 3 weeks from a town 60 miles north. She described the same scenario. A man appearing at her door with a story about needing help, then waking up imprisoned in permafrost. Both victims described their captor as approximately 40 years old, over 6 feet tall with a thick beard and a calm demeanor that was somehow more terrifying than any aggression. He would visit twice a day to provide food and water, speaking to them in a measured tone about patience and preparation, though neither victim understood what he meant. We evacuated both victims immediately, while Hayes coordinated a full tactical sweep of the tunnel system. Over the next 6 hours, we discovered the true scope of what we were dealing with. The complex extended over 200 yards in multiple directions, connecting to at least 5 other exit points scattered across the surrounding wilderness. Each exit was concealed beneath natural features like fallen logs or rock outcroppings, impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. The excavation had clearly taken years to complete, dug during the coldest months when the permafrost was most stable and easier to work. In a chamber we designated as the workshop, we found tools, plans, and a notebook that detailed everything. The man had been developing this system since 2016, learning permafrost engineering through online resources and slowly expanding his underground network. The notebook contained lists of potential targets, all isolated homesteads or properties with minimal traffic. He had been studying families for months before taking them, documenting their routines, their vehicles, even their garbage patterns. The Morrison family had been under surveillance for 8 months. What made my stomach turn was discovering that the 2 empty cells had been occupied recently. The notebook referenced 4 previous victims by first name only. Catherine Morrison, the wife, was listed as having been moved to a secondary location 3 days prior. Her sons, Marcus and Ian, were marked as transferred yesterday. The secondary location was referenced by coordinates, and when we tracked them, they led to another homestead 30 miles away, this one abandoned for over a decade. By the time we reached the second location at dawn, the scene was already cold. We found another tunnel entrance, this one more elaborate with a proper ventilation system and reinforced supports. The layout was similar but larger, with 8 cells instead of 6. All of them were empty. Catherine Morrison and her sons were gone. We found evidence they had been there: clothing items, a school ID belonging to Marcus, and a photo of the family that had been carefully placed on a shelf, but the occupants and their captor had vanished. The investigation that followed consumed the next 4 months of my life. FBI agents, forensic specialists, and search teams combed through both tunnel systems and surrounding areas. We identified the perpetrator through DNA evidence left throughout the complex. His name was Robert Callahan, a former petroleum engineer who had worked in Alaska for 15 years before quitting his job in 2015 and disappearing into the wilderness. He had purchased the Morrison property under a shell corporation, using it as his base while constructing his underground prison network. Callahan had knowledge of permafrost mechanics that he had gained through legitimate work, and he had perverted that expertise into creating spaces that were nearly impossible to detect from the surface. The frozen ground acted as natural insulation and structural support, allowing him to carve out rooms that would remain stable year-round as long as they stayed below the frost line. He had been extraordinarily careful, never taking more than 2 people from any single location, spreading his abductions across hundreds of miles to avoid pattern recognition. We recovered security footage from a gas station 80 miles south that showed Callahan purchasing supplies 2 days before we found the first tunnel. He was driving a white pickup with a camper shell, and the footage clearly showed someone moving in the back of the truck. The search expanded immediately, but Alaska has over 665,000 square miles of territory, most of it wilderness. Finding one man who understood how to live off-grid in this environment was nearly impossible. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, a hiker found Catherine Morrison wandering along a remote trail near Denali. She was severely dehydrated and hypothermic, barely conscious. When she recovered enough to speak, she described being held in another underground location, this one even more remote. She said Callahan had told her he was relocating his operation because law enforcement was getting too close. He had taken her sons separately, claiming he was moving them to different sites for security purposes. She had managed to escape when Callahan left the entrance unsealed during a supply run, and she had walked for nearly 2 days before collapsing. The coordinates Catherine provided led us to a third site, but again, it was empty. This time, we found evidence that Callahan had deliberately collapsed parts of the tunnel system behind him, sealing off access and destroying evidence. We recovered items belonging to Marcus and Ian Morrison, but the boys themselves were not there. Catherine had no information about where they might have been taken, only that Callahan had mentioned something about moving them north toward the Brooks Range. The case remains open, officially unsolved. Marcus and Ian Morrison have not been found, despite one of the largest search operations in Alaska State Trooper history. Robert Callahan is still at large, though there have been no confirmed sightings since 2019. The FBI believes he may have fled Alaska entirely, possibly to Canada or even Russia across the Bering Strait. Other theories suggest he is still operating in the most remote parts of the state, perhaps building new tunnel systems where no one will think to look. I transferred to a desk position 6 months after the case went cold. I could not continue patrol work in the valley without scanning every homestead I passed, wondering what might exist beneath the surface. The knowledge that someone could be using the very ground beneath our feet as a prison, exploiting the permafrost that defines this state, fundamentally changed how I see Alaska. Catherine Morrison never recovered psychologically from her ordeal. She moved to Washington State to live with family and refuses to speak about what happened beyond her initial statements. Sometimes I pull up the case file and review the evidence, hoping something new will jump out. The notebook Callahan left behind contained over 200 names and addresses, people he had been watching but never took. We contacted every single one, warning them, advising security measures. But I know there are others he documented in ways we have not found yet. And I know that permafrost exists across the entire northern region, offering him an unlimited canvas for his engineering if he is still alive and active. What haunts me most is not what we found in those tunnels, but what we did not find. The notebook referenced previous iterations, earlier versions of his system, that he had deemed failures and abandoned. We never located those sites. We never found out how many people might still be down there, sealed in forgotten chambers beneath frozen ground where their bodies will be preserved perfectly until someone stumbles across them, decades or centuries from now. Alaska keeps its secrets buried deep, and Robert Callahan understood that better than anyone. I worked as a ranger at Denali National Park for 9 years before I understood that some people who go missing in the wilderness do not want to be found. They are taken. The park encompasses over 6 million acres of Alaska wilderness, and most visitors see only the first 15 miles of maintained road. Beyond that, it is just raw terrain, tundra, and mountains where grizzlies outnumber people, and cell service is a luxury from another world. During those 9 years, I responded to hundreds of incidents, injured hikers, lost tourists, wildlife encounters, but nothing prepared me for the summer of 2019 when the screaming started. The first report came through dispatch on a Tuesday morning in late June. A couple from Ohio hiking the Savage River Trail claimed they heard a woman screaming for help approximately 200 yards into the tree line. They described it as desperate, high-pitched, like someone was being attacked. When they tried to locate the source, the scream stopped abruptly. Standard protocol had me and my partner Kyle heading out within 20 minutes with a search dog and emergency equipment. We hiked the area for 3 hours, calling out, scanning for any sign of disturbance. Nothing. The forest was quiet except for the wind moving through spruce branches and the occasional raven overhead. 3 days later, another hiker reported the exact same thing. Same trail, same approximate location, same desperate female screaming. This time, it was a solo backpacker from California. A man in his 50s with decades of hiking experience who swore something was wrong. He said the screams sounded too perfect, too consistent in pitch and duration, like they were being played rather than actually happening. That detail stuck with me because it was such a specific observation. We searched again with a larger team, bringing in volunteers from the Park Service and even a helicopter for aerial surveillance. Still nothing. By the end of July, we had received 11 separate reports of screaming from various points along popular trails, Always a woman. Always described as desperate and terrified. Always stopping suddenly when people tried to help. The disturbing pattern was that anyone who actually went into the woods to investigate never came back to file a second report. They would radio that they were going off trail to check the source, and then we would lose contact. Within 24 hours, they would be reported missing by their hiking partners or family members back home. I started mapping the incidents on a park terrain chart in my office, using different colored pins for each report. When I stepped back and looked at the pattern, my stomach dropped. The screams were being reported along a very specific route, one that connected to an abandoned research station deep in the backcountry. The station had been used in the 1980s for wildlife studies before funding dried up and it was left to rot. I had been there once during training, a cluster of wooden buildings slowly being reclaimed by moss and weather. It was off limits to the public, marked clearly on park maps as restricted area, but accessible if you knew the old service roads. I brought my findings to the head ranger, a man named Tom, who had been with the park for 30 years. He listened to everything, studied the map, and his expression changed from concern to something closer to anger. He told me the station had been a problem before, back in the mid-90s, when a former park employee had been caught living there illegally. The man had been removed and charged with trespassing, but the incident had been kept quiet to avoid panic among visitors. Tom said the employee had been obsessed with the isolation, with the idea of disappearing completely from society. His name was Marcus Verne, and he had worked trail maintenance for 6 years before anyone realized he was using park resources to build a permanent shelter in the backcountry. I asked Tom if Marcus could be involved now, nearly 25 years later. Tom said the man would be in his 60s, and as far as he knew, Marcus had moved out of state after his release from a brief jail stint. But Tom also admitted that no one had actually verified his whereabouts in years. The Park Service had moved on, and Marcus had faded into memory. I requested permission to investigate the old research station, and after some hesitation, Tom approved a small reconnaissance mission. Kyle and I, along with 2 additional rangers and a state trooper, would hike in and assess the situation. We set out early on a Friday morning, taking the service road as far as it was passable before continuing on foot. The hike took us through dense forest and across rivers swollen with glacial melt. The air was thick with mosquitoes, and the temperature was unseasonably warm, making every step feel heavier. After 6 hours, we reached the clearing where the research station sat. From a distance, it looked abandoned. Roofs sagging, windows broken, vegetation creeping up the sides of the structures. But as we approached, I noticed details that did not fit. Fresh boot prints in the mud near the main building. A tarp stretched across one roof that looked new. Smoke residue around a makeshift fire pit that had been used recently. We spread out and began checking each building systematically. The first 2 were empty, filled with debris and animal droppings. The third building, a long bunkhouse-style structure, had its door padlocked from the outside. Kyle cut the lock with bolt cutters, and when we pushed the door open, the smell hit us immediately. Unwashed bodies, human waste, fear. Inside, we found 4 people, 2 women and 2 men, all in their 20s and 30s, all filthy and malnourished, all chained to metal bed frames that had been bolted to the floor. They reacted to our presence with confusion and terror, like they could not process that we were real. One woman kept saying it was a trick, that he was testing them. Kyle radioed for medical evacuation immediately, while the state trooper and I started working on the chains. They were secured with heavy-duty padlocks, the kind used for industrial equipment, and it took us nearly 20 minutes to get everyone free. While we worked, the victims began describing their captor, an older man, white beard, over 6 feet tall with a calm voice that never raised even when he was threatening them. He had taken each of them from different trails over the span of 3 months, luring them off the path with recorded screams played through hidden speakers he had placed in the forest. Once they followed the sound, he would ambush them from behind, using chemical sedatives he administered through syringes. They would wake up here, chained in this building, with no idea how much time had passed. He visited twice a day, bringing food and water, and would talk to them about survival, about how civilization had made people weak, about how he was teaching them to endure. One woman described how he had shown her his setup, a network of motion-activated speakers placed along trails, all wired to a central control system he had built using solar panels and old car batteries. He was proud of his engineering, she said, and he wanted them to appreciate his intelligence. While we were getting the victims ready for transport, Kyle found the control shed behind the bunkhouse. It was a small structure, almost completely hidden by overgrown bushes. Inside was exactly what the woman had described, a panel covered in switches and dials connected to dozens of speakers positioned throughout miles of forest. There were also notebooks, meticulously detailed logs of every hiker he had observed, every person he had targeted, every recording he had made. The screams were not random. He had recorded a real woman, someone he had taken years ago, and had been playing her voice over and over to lure new victims. The state trooper radioed for backup, and within an hour we had a full tactical team on site. But by then, Marcus Verne, because it was him, exactly as Tom had described, had already fled. We found evidence that he had been watching us from the tree line, boot prints leading away from the station, a pair of binoculars left on a stump, still warm from his hands. He knew we were coming, probably saw us from the moment we entered the clearing, and he had vanished into the backcountry where he had spent decades learning every ridge and valley. The search for Marcus became one of the largest manhunts in Alaska history. Helicopters, tracking dogs, expert wilderness trackers, all deployed across Denali and surrounding areas. We found more of his speaker systems, at least 20 different locations rigged with hidden equipment. Each one was deactivated and removed, but the scale of his operation was staggering. He had been doing this for years, perhaps even during his time as a park employee, building his network slowly and patiently. 3 weeks into the search, a backpacker reported seeing an older man matching Marcus' description near a frozen lake 40 miles north of the research station. A helicopter was dispatched immediately, and they spotted him attempting to cross the ice on foot. When he realized he was being pursued, Marcus started running, but the ice was thin, weakened by the unseasonably warm summer. Witnesses from the helicopter said he broke through near the center of the lake, and despite attempts to rescue him, he went under and never resurfaced. Dive teams searched for days, but the lake was deep and murky, and his body was never recovered. The 4 victims we rescued were hospitalized for weeks, treated for malnutrition, infections, and severe psychological trauma. They all survived, but their lives were irrevocably changed. One woman never returned to hiking. Another moved to a city and refuses to be near open wilderness. Their testimonies helped us piece together the full scope of Marcus' activities. We identified 12 missing hikers from the past 8 years that matched his logs. Some remains were found in shallow graves near the research station. Others were never located. The park installed new emergency communication systems along major trails and increased ranger patrols. Warning signs were posted about staying on marked paths and reporting any unusual sounds. But for me, the damage was already done. I could not patrol those trails anymore without hearing phantom screams in my mind, without wondering if every rustle in the trees was another hidden speaker or another predator watching. I transferred to an office position within the Park Service and eventually left Alaska entirely. Sometimes I think about Marcus Verne sinking into that frozen lake, and I wonder if he is really gone. His body was never found, and Alaska has a way of hiding things that do not want to be discovered. The research station was demolished, the speaker systems destroyed, but the forest remains. And somewhere in those 6 million acres, there might still be recordings playing, voices crying out for help that no one should ever follow. I answered emergency calls in Fairbanks for 7 years before the night I received a call from a phone number that had not existed for 15 years. The woman on the line was reporting her own murder. People assume that working as a 911 dispatcher means you have heard everything, that nothing can shock you anymore after years of listening to humanity at its worst moments. But they are wrong. Some calls change you in ways that never heal, and some mysteries refuse to stay buried no matter how hard you try to forget them. The Fairbanks Dispatch Center operates 24 hours a day, staffed by a rotating crew of 8 dispatchers who handle everything from medical emergencies to domestic disputes across a sprawling jurisdiction that covers thousands of square miles. I work the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. 4 nights a week. Those hours were usually quieter than daytime, with most calls coming from bar fights or drunk driving incidents along the highway. The night of October 14th, 2018 started no differently than any other Wednesday. My coffee was lukewarm, my console lights glowed in the dim room, and I was reviewing notes from the previous shift when the call came through at 2:23 a.m. The caller ID displayed a local Fairbanks number, 907-535-28407, and when I answered with my standard greeting, I heard a woman breathing rapidly on the other end. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was strained and terrified, but also strange in a way I could not immediately identify. She said her name was Jennifer Larson, and that someone was breaking into her apartment. She gave an address on 12th Avenue near the university, apartment 3B, and described hearing the front door being forced open while she hid in her bedroom closet. I dispatched 2 patrol units immediately and kept Jennifer on the line, speaking calmly and trying to keep her focused. She whispered that she could hear footsteps in her living room now, heavy boots moving slowly, deliberately searching. I told her to stay quiet, to keep the phone close, and that officers were less than 4 minutes away. Then she said something that made my blood freeze. She whispered that the footsteps had stopped outside her bedroom door, and she could see shadow movement through the gap at the bottom. Then her voice changed, became almost resigned, and she said, "He's here. Tell my parents I'm sorry. Tell them I tried to run." The line did not disconnect. I heard the bedroom door crash open, heard Jennifer scream, and then sounds of a violent struggle. Furniture breaking, things hitting walls, her voice crying out and then suddenly muffled like someone had covered her mouth. I was shouting her name, begging her to respond, while simultaneously updating the responding units that an assault was in progress. Then I heard a man's voice, calm and cold, say directly into the phone, "She should have stayed home that night." The call ended. Officers arrived at the address on 12th Avenue within 3 minutes of the call ending. They forced entry into apartment 3B and found it completely empty. Not just vacant, but abandoned. No furniture, no signs of recent habitation, dust covering every surface. The landlord was contacted and confirmed that apartment 3B had been empty for over 6 months, the previous tenant having moved out in April. There was no Jennifer Larson listed as ever having lived there. No signs of forced entry, no disturbance. Nothing to indicate anyone had been inside that apartment recently, let alone within the last hour. I pulled the phone records immediately, needing to understand what had just happened. The number that had called me, 907-555-2847, showed up in our system records as having placed the call at 2:23 a.m. But when I cross-referenced it with the phone company database, that number had been disconnected in 2003. 15 years prior. The physical line associated with that number had been removed during an infrastructure upgrade, and the number itself had never been reassigned. According to every official record, that phone number did not exist anymore and had not existed for a decade and a half. I reported everything to my supervisor, a man named Dave who had been with dispatch for 20 years. He listened to the recorded call with me, and I watched his expression change from concern to confusion, to something approaching fear. The recording was clear, high quality, capturing every word Jennifer had said and every sound of the attack. It was not static, not distorted, but a legitimate emergency call that had been routed through our system. Dave made calls to the phone company technical department demanding explanations, but they had none. The call should have been impossible. We filed a formal incident report and flagged it for investigation, but that is when things became even stranger. Dave ran the name Jennifer Larson through our database of previous calls and missing persons reports. He found a match. In October 2003, exactly 15 years prior almost to the day, a 22-year-old woman named Jennifer Larson had been reported missing by her family. She had been a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and lived off campus in an apartment on 12th Avenue. The address listed in the original missing persons report was the same address she had given me on the phone, apartment 3B. According to the original case file, Jennifer had called 911 on the night of October 13, 2003, reporting an intruder in her apartment. The dispatcher at the time had sent units to her location, but when officers arrived, they found the apartment door locked from the inside and no response to their knocking. They eventually gained entry with the landlord's assistance and found the apartment empty. No Jennifer, no signs of struggle, nothing out of place. It had been treated as a false alarm or possibly a prank call. Jennifer's car was found in the parking lot. Her purse and phone were in the apartment, but she was never seen. Again, the family had pushed for a full investigation, insisting something terrible had happened. But without evidence of foul play, the case went cold. No body was ever found, no suspects were ever identified, and eventually the file was archived as an unsolved missing person case. Reading through the details, I felt physically ill. The call I had received was nearly identical to the call received in 2003, down to specific phrases. She had used the same description of hearing footsteps, hiding in the closet, seeing shadows under the door. Dave and I brought this information to the Fairbanks Police Department, and a detective named Sarah Mills was assigned to review both incidents. She listened to my recording and compared it to the archived recording from 2003. The voices matched. Audio analysis confirmed that both calls had been made by the same woman, or at the very least by someone who sounded identical. But that should have been impossible because Jennifer Larson had been missing for 15 years and was presumed dead. Detective Mills reopened the investigation and began interviewing everyone connected to the original case. Jennifer's parents were still living in Fairbanks, and when Mills played them the new recording, her mother collapsed. She swore it was her daughter's voice, that she would recognize it anywhere. Jennifer's father became obsessed with the idea that his daughter was still alive somewhere, being held captive, somehow able to make calls but unable to escape. Mills tried to temper his hope, explaining the technical impossibility of the situation, but he refused to accept it. The investigation expanded. Mills brought in FBI specialists to analyze the phone records and the audio recordings. They confirmed what we already knew. The number should not have been able to make calls. The voice was consistent across 15 years, and there was no rational explanation. One theory proposed was that someone had recreated the original call as a cruel hoax, perhaps using archived audio to splice together a fake emergency. But the audio forensics team found no evidence of editing or manipulation. The call I received was continuous, live, and responsive to what I was saying. Then Mills made a discovery that changed everything. She obtained Jennifer's original phone records from 2003 and noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. On the night Jennifer disappeared, she had made multiple calls in the hours before her 911 call. Most were to friends or family, normal conversation. But there was one call to an unknown number, lasting 47 minutes, made around 8 p.m. the night she vanished. Mills traced that number and found it belonged to a man named Eric Voss, who had worked maintenance at the university housing department in 2003. Eric Voss had been questioned briefly during the original investigation as part of routine interviews with anyone who might have had access to student apartments. He claimed to have never met Jennifer personally and had an alibi for the night she disappeared, stating he had been home with his girlfriend. That alibi was never thoroughly verified because there had been no evidence of a crime. Mills tracked Voss to his current location. He was still living in Fairbanks, working for a different property management company. And when she showed up at his workplace to question him, his reaction was immediate and telling. He ran. Officers apprehended Voss 3 blocks away, and during questioning, his story fell apart completely. He admitted to having had a brief relationship with Jennifer in September 2003, one that had ended badly when she discovered he had been accessing her apartment without permission, coming in when she was not home and going through her belongings. She had threatened to report him, which would have cost him his job and possibly led to criminal charges. He swore he had not hurt her, that she was alive the last time he saw her, but he also admitted he had been in her apartment the night she disappeared. Voss claimed Jennifer had called him that night, hysterical, saying someone was in her apartment. He had gone there to help but found the door locked and no one answering. He said he left and went home, too afraid to get involved because of their previous issues. But Mills did not believe him, and neither did the prosecutors, who eventually charged him with Jennifer's murder, despite having no body and only circumstantial evidence. During the trial, which took place in early 2019, the recordings became key evidence. The jury heard both the 2003 call and my 2018 call, and expert witnesses testified about the impossibility of the second call existing. The defense argued that the supernatural nature of the evidence proved their client's innocence, that clearly something beyond human understanding was at play. The prosecution argued that Voss had killed Jennifer in 2003 and that somehow her final moments had been captured and replayed 15 years later as a message from beyond, demanding justice. The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning a guilty verdict. Voss was sentenced to 60 years in prison for second-degree murder, but he never confessed, and Jennifer's body was never found. Her parents attended every day of the trial, and when the verdict was read, they wept with relief that someone was finally being held accountable. But I could see in their eyes that they would never have full closure without knowing where their daughter was. What haunts me most about this case is not the impossibility of the call, though that alone should be enough to keep anyone awake at night. It is the pattern. After the trial, I went back through our archives on my own time, searching for similar anomalies. I found 3 other cases over the past 20 years where 911 calls had been received from disconnected numbers, calls that matched missing persons cases from years or even decades prior. In each case, the calls had been dismissed as technical glitches or prank calls. No one had ever connected them to the original disappearances. One call from 2011 matched a missing woman from 1998. Another from 2015 matched a missing teenager from 2007. The third was from 2017, matching a woman who had disappeared in 1995. I brought all of this to Detective Mills, and she assigned investigators to each case. 2 of the 3 have since been solved. One led to the discovery of remains buried on a remote property outside Fairbanks. Another led to the arrest of a former boyfriend who confessed under pressure of the new evidence. The third case remains open. I left dispatch work in 2020. I could not continue answering calls knowing that some of them might be coming from people who no longer exist in the way we understand existence. The job requires you to believe that you are helping people in real time, that your actions can change outcomes. But what do you do when time itself seems broken? When the past reaches forward and the dead speak through disconnected lines? Jennifer Larson's case officially remains unsolved despite Voss' conviction, because without a body, there are always questions. Her parents still live in Fairbanks, still hoping that one day someone will find her remains and bring her home. I think about that call every single day. I think about her voice, so clear and present, describing events that happened 15 years before I heard them. I think about the man who killed her walking free for a decade and a half before her recorded scream finally caught up with him. Sometimes, late at night, when I cannot sleep, I wonder how many other calls are out there, trapped in some space between then and now, waiting for the right moment to break through. How many voices are trying to reach us from the past, describing their final moments, begging for help that can never arrive in time. And I wonder if someday my phone will ring and I will hear my own voice on the other end calling from a future I have not yet reached, warning me about something I cannot prevent. The phone system is just technology, just wires and signals and switches. That is what the engineers tell me when I ask how a disconnected number can make calls. They say it is impossible, that their systems do not allow for such anomalies. But I have the recordings, I have the evidence, and I have the memory of Jennifer Larson's voice, terrified and desperate, reaching across 15 years of silence to name her killer and demand justice. Some mysteries do not have rational explanations, and some calls are meant to be answered even when they come from numbers that no longer exist. I worked cold cases for Anchorage Police Department for 13 years before DNA evidence from 1996 finally gave us a name, but what we found when we went to arrest him made me wish we had never solved it. Cold cases are different from active investigations. With fresh crimes, there is urgency, adrenaline, hope that you might catch someone before they hurt anyone else. With cold cases, the urgency comes from a different place entirely. The victim is gone, sometimes for decades, but their family is still waiting. They are still hoping that someday someone will care enough to reopen the file and search for answers. That is what I devoted my career to, finding those answers, no matter how long ago the crime occurred. The Morrison case landed on my desk on a Tuesday in January 2018. Margaret Morrison, age 27, disappeared from an Anchorage parking lot on March 14, 1996. She had left her office building at 5:30 p.m. to go to her car, and she was never seen again. Her vehicle was found 12 hours later in the parking garage, driver door open, keys on the floorboard, purse in the back seat. The police report from 1996 had documented everything meticulously. No signs of forced entry to the vehicle, no signs of a struggle outside it, no witnesses. It was as if Margaret had simply evaporated into thin air between her office and her car. The original detective had pursued several leads, questioning known sex offenders in the area and Margaret's ex-boyfriends. Nothing panned out. No physical evidence was ever recovered. The case went cold within 6 months, and Margaret was joined by hundreds of other unsolved disappearances in the filing cabinets of the Anchorage police. For 22 years, her file sat untouched while her parents aged and eventually passed away without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Then, technology caught up with the past. In 2018, a private genealogy company that was used primarily for ancestry research announced that they were allowing law enforcement to search their database. They had been contacted by a detective who wanted to match DNA found at a crime scene to individuals in their system. Within months, law enforcement agencies across the country were using genealogy databases to solve decades-old cold cases. The technique had already led to the arrest of the Golden State Killer in California, a serial murderer who had operated for years without being caught. The Morrison case had DNA evidence, a partial sample that had been collected from Margaret's fingernails during the original autopsy. Likely from her attacker during a struggle, the sample had been preserved in a police evidence locker, and when I sent it to be processed against the genealogy database, I waited for results with a mixture of hope and dread. In March 2018, I received an email from the analyst. There was a match. The DNA did not directly match anyone in the criminal database, but it matched a family tree on the genealogy site. The closest matches were siblings and parents, which meant the perpetrator had a relative who had submitted their DNA for ancestry purposes. Cross-referencing with available records, we narrowed down the match to 2 individuals. One was a woman living in Colorado with no criminal history. The other was a man named David Chen, age 45, living in an unremarkable neighborhood in South Anchorage. According to available records, David had been living in Anchorage since 1993. He worked as an accountant and had no criminal history. He had never been questioned in connection with Margaret's disappearance, but something about the timeline clicked. In March 1996, when Margaret disappeared, David had been living in the area. He had been 23 years old at the time. I obtained a warrant to collect David's DNA directly, and when the results came back, they matched the evidence from Margaret's fingernails perfectly. I had him. After 22 years, I had finally solved the Morrison case. The arrest warrant was prepared, and I made arrangements to bring David in for questioning. What I did not expect was what I would discover in his home when I executed the search warrant. David lived in a small house on the edge of Anchorage, in a neighborhood where properties were spread out and neighbors were not particularly attentive to their surroundings. When I arrived with a team of 6 officers and a forensic evidence crew, the house appeared perfectly normal from the outside. A well-maintained yard, clean windows, no indication that anything sinister lay within. When we forced entry and began searching, I found his office on the 2nd floor. And that is when I realized that Margaret Morrison was not his only victim. The office walls were covered with photographs. Not family photos or vacation pictures. Crime scene photographs. Autopsy photographs. Photos of missing women, some of them unsolved cases from across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. But David had been doing something darker than simply collecting images of tragedy. He had been documenting his own work. There were at least 30 different women represented in those photographs, ages ranging from 19 to 42. Some I recognized from cold case files. Others I had never seen before. The forensic team photographed everything before removing the materials as evidence. On his computer, which we accessed with a court order, I found organized files with the same meticulous system. Each woman had a folder with dates, times, locations, and extremely detailed descriptions of what he had done to them. There were confessions written out in narrative form, almost like journal entries, describing the abduction, the assault, the murder, and the disposal of the bodies. But most chilling of all, there were videos. Long video recordings of his crimes filmed from his perspective. Watching those videos was the most difficult thing I had done in 13 years of investigating cold cases. I forced myself to view enough of them to confirm their authenticity, to establish that David was not fantasizing but actually documenting real murders. The quality of the footage improved over the years, suggesting he had updated his equipment as technology progressed. The earliest recordings were from 1995. The most recent was from 2016, only 2 years before we arrested him. This man had been actively murdering women for over 20 years while working as an accountant and maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Among the materials I recovered was a journal David had been keeping since his teenage years. It documented his fantasies, his obsessions, his gradual transition from thoughts to actions. He had written extensively about Margaret Morrison, about how she had caught him because she had fought back, because she had scratched him with her fingernails and left DNA evidence that would not surface until technology advanced enough to find it. He expressed pride in this fact, treating it as a prediction he had made that had come true. He wrote about anticipating his eventual capture and seemed almost relieved when it occurred, as if a burden had been lifted. The search of his property extended beyond the house. We dug up the backyard and found remains, multiple sets of remains, some dating back 20 years. The forensic anthropologist on the case estimated we had found at least 7 victims in that yard alone. David eventually confessed to murdering 34 women across a 23-year period, though he initially denied all charges. Only when confronted with the video evidence did he acknowledge what he had done. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. But here is where the case becomes something much worse than a standard serial killer prosecution. During the investigation, we discovered that David had been connected to law enforcement through his employment. He had obtained private security clearance through a contractor who did work for the military. He had been vetted and cleared, which gave him additional resources and possibly additional confidence in his ability to evade detection. More disturbing than that, we discovered that David had been in communication with other men online, exchanging photographs and videos of victims through encrypted channels. The FBI investigation that followed led to the identification of a network of at least 12 men engaged in similar activities across Alaska and the lower 48 states. What still haunts me is not just the fact that David killed 34 women. It is the fact that he came close to being stopped multiple times and was not. In 2003, one of his potential victims escaped his vehicle and reported the abduction to police. David was questioned but denied everything, and without evidence, he was released. The woman who escaped had been traumatized and eventually moved away, discouraged by the perceived lack of police investigation. In 2007, a detective working a different case had noted similarities between several disappearances and had flagged them for further investigation. But funding and resources were limited, and the file was deprioritized. Nothing came of that investigation. Margaret Morrison's family finally received closure in 2019 when David was convicted, and her remains were officially identified and released for burial. Her mother had passed away in 2003 without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. Her father died in 2015, also without answers. Only Margaret's sister remained to attend the funeral, and when she looked at me after the guilty verdict was read, I saw decades of pain finally transform into something approaching peace. But that peace came at an enormous cost. 33 other families had to discover that their loved ones had been murdered by someone the system had noticed and then forgotten. They had to confront the reality that those women might still be alive if someone had pursued the investigations more thoroughly, if resources had been allocated differently, if someone like me had cared enough 23 years earlier to push harder for answers. The technology that eventually solved Margaret Morrison's case has now been used to solve hundreds of other cold cases across the country. DNA genealogy has become a standard tool in law enforcement, but I'm not certain it is always justice that the technique provides. Sometimes it is just the inevitable discovery of horrors we could have stopped if we had simply cared enough when there was still time to save lives. David Chen is serving his sentence in a maximum security prison in Anchorage. He will never be released. His life is effectively over, confined to a cell, his legacy a testament to human depravity. But that does not comfort the families. That does not return the women he murdered. That does not change the fact that I spent 13 years investigating cold cases and found that the past is sometimes more terrible than we can imagine, and sometimes more preventable than we are willing to acknowledge. I quit the cold case unit in 2020. I could not continue investigating old murders, knowing that I would never have all the answers, that somewhere I would miss a connection that could have saved someone. Margaret Morrison's case gave me closure only insofar as closure is possible when you have solved a crime but cannot undo it. Her file is now closed. 22 years of waiting finally ended. But somewhere, in filing cabinets and evidence lockers and forgotten reports, there are still hundreds of other cases waiting for someone to care enough to find the answers they deserve. I patrolled the Kenai Peninsula waterways for 10 years as a fish and wildlife officer before we started finding the barrels. At first, we thought it was illegal dumping. We were so wrong. The Kenai Peninsula is one of Alaska's most beautiful regions, a place where the wilderness touches the water, and fishing is not just a pastime but a way of life for thousands of people. The rivers flow with salmon. The air smells like salt and possibility, and tourists come from around the world hoping to land the catch of a lifetime. It is also one of the most remote areas in the state, where rivers twist through uninhabited valleys, and access points are limited to those who know where to look. My job as a wildlife officer involved patrolling those waterways, monitoring fish populations, checking fishing licenses, and investigating poaching. It was routine work most of the time, standing on riverbanks in the rain, radioing coordinates, processing citations. But on August 12th, 2017, I received a call about something unusual. A commercial fishing vessel had caught a large metal barrel in their nets near the mouth of the Kenai River. The barrel was sealed, locked, and when they hauled it aboard, they noticed liquid sloshing inside. Concerned that it might be hazardous waste, they radioed the authorities and stayed put to wait for me to arrive. I took a state boat downriver to meet them, my equipment case secured in the cabin. The barrel was sitting on the deck of the vessel, covered in marine growth and rust, approximately 4 feet tall and perhaps 3 feet in diameter. The fishermen, 2 men named Dale and Marcus, both looked uneasy. Dale told me that in 30 years of fishing, he had never seen anything like it, that the way it came up in the net felt wrong. They had noticed that it was unusually heavy for its size, and when they had tried to open it, they found it was locked from the outside with an industrial padlock. I photographed it and made arrangements to have it transported to a facility where it could be safely examined. The next morning, a hazmat team and forensic specialists joined me at the evidence holding yard. They cut open the barrel carefully, prepared for chemical exposure or biohazard contamination. What they found instead was far worse than hazardous materials. Inside the barrel, preserved in a solution of brine and formaldehyde, were human remains. Parts of what appeared to be a human body, carefully preserved in solution, like some kind of grotesque specimen collection. The forensic pathologist who examined the barrel was deeply disturbed by what he was seeing. He determined that the remains belonged to at least one individual, likely female, based on bone structure, and that the preservation method suggested someone with knowledge of anatomy or biology. The remains had been placed in the barrel sometime between 6 months and 2 years prior based on the condition of the bones and the state of the preservative. This was not accidental, not natural death followed by illegal dumping. This was deliberate preservation. This was a message or a mistake, a secret kept until the river gave it away. I filed a report with Alaska State Police and brought in additional investigators. Within 48 hours, I received word that divers and patrol boats had been deployed to search the Kenai River for additional barrels. Over the next 3 weeks, we recovered 7 more sealed barrels from different locations along the river system. Each one contained human remains. Each one had been preserved in the same careful manner. Each one told a story of deliberate placement, strategic disposal, methodical planning. The forensic analysis determined that the remains in each barrel belonged to different individuals, both men and women, ranging in age from early 20s to mid-50s. Some of the remains were more recent, perhaps only months old. Others were years old, their bones beginning to show the early stages of mineral dissolution despite the preservation attempt. Dental records and DNA analysis allowed authorities to identify 5 of the 8 victims. All were reported missing persons from the Anchorage area over a period spanning 7 years. All had been classified as voluntary disappearances or runaways based on circumstantial evidence. The investigation quickly escalated. The FBI became involved, and specialized forensic teams worked around the clock, analyzing the barrels themselves for fingerprints, manufacturing marks, anything that could connect them to a perpetrator. What they found was extraordinary. The barrels had been manufactured in a specific batch by a Seattle-based company and sold to a limited number of commercial entities in Alaska. Cross-referencing sales records with addresses in the Anchorage area, investigators identified a short list of potential buyers. One name stood out immediately, a man named Robert Petrov, who who owned a small marine salvage and restoration business on the outskirts of Anchorage. He had purchased 12 barrels from the supplier in 2010 and had requested more in 2015 and 2018. When investigators checked his business location, they found his facility was perfect for what had been done. An old warehouse with a private dock access to a tributary of the Kenai River, overlooking the waterway where the barrels had been recovered. Security footage from nearby businesses showed regular activity at his facility during evening and night hours, times when no legitimate salvage work would typically be occurring. A warrant was obtained to search the facility. What officers found was a nightmare made concrete. The warehouse contained a workshop in which barrels were being carefully prepared. Preservation chemicals were stored in industrial quantities. Anatomical charts and medical textbooks lined the shelves. Most disturbing of all was a detailed notebook containing descriptions of victims, dates of acquisition, notes about their condition when brought to the facility, and specific details about the preservation process. The notebook spanned 12 years and referenced at least 41 individuals by description and date. Robert Petrov was arrested at his home, and during questioning, he initially remained silent. But when confronted with the physical evidence, he began to speak. His story was one of deliberate predation spanning over a decade. He had been targeting homeless individuals, transient populations, people whose disappearances would not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. He would approach them with offers of work, shelter, money, and when they accepted, he would bring them to his facility. Once inside, he would drug them, restrain them, and subject them to what he described as medical observation. He claimed his motivation was research, that he was studying human physiology in ways that institutional research would never allow. He documented everything he did to them, photographing, measuring, recording observations. When his subjects were no longer useful to him, he would kill them and place them in the barrels filled with preservation solution. He had developed a system for storing the barrels submerged in the river, using weighted anchors, retrieving them periodically to check on the specimens, and add fresh preservative. It was a careful, methodical operation that had gone undiscovered for over a decade. The investigation expanded rapidly. Divers recovered additional barrels from the river that had been anchored and hidden. Some contained remains that were decades old, suggesting Petrov had been active even longer than his records indicated. The DNA found in the barrels began to reveal connections to other missing persons cases, not just in Alaska, but across Washington and Oregon. Federal investigators established that Petrov had operated in multiple locations, moving from state to state, running similar businesses as fronts for his predatory activities. During the trial, which lasted nearly 6 months, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of Petrov's crimes. The detailed notebook became the centerpiece of the case, as it documented each victim with clinical precision. The prosecution argued that Petrov was operating a deliberate murder and dismemberment factory, with the river serving as his filing system. The defense attempted to argue that Petrov was mentally ill, that he should be institutionalized rather than imprisoned, but the jury saw through the argument. The crimes were too calculated, too planned, too deliberate to be the product of diminished capacity. Robert Petrov was convicted of 34 counts of murder and an additional 47 counts of related charges. He received multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. As part of a plea agreement in a later proceeding, he revealed the locations of additional barrels still submerged in the river. Divers recovered 3 more before the search was called off, bringing the total confirmed victims to 44. But Petrov's notebooks referenced 62 individuals, meaning at least 18 people whose remains may still be in the Kenai River system, hidden in barrels weighted down in the dark water. Since Petrov's conviction, I have not been able to return to my job with the same sense of purpose. Every time I patrol the Kenai River, I think about those barrels, about how long they might have been down there, about how many more might still be waiting in the depths to be discovered. The river that once represented beauty and abundance now represents something darker. It is a monument to human depravity, an aquatic graveyard carefully tended by a man who understood the wilderness so well that he used it to hide his crimes in plain sight. The 5 identified victims have finally been given proper burials. Their families, after years of not knowing what happened, finally have closure of sorts. But for the 19 victims whose remains are still missing, there will be no closure. They remain in the water, preserved in barrels, part of the ecosystem now, feeding the fish that other people will one day catch and eat. Their atoms dispersed into the food chain. Their story told only in the careful measurements and observations Robert Petrov documented in his notebook. I wonder sometimes if the fishermen who originally caught that first barrel realized they were the ones who solved the mystery. They were the unknowing detectives who brought the truth up from the river's bottom, breaking the cycle of hiding that might have continued indefinitely. I coordinated search and rescue operations across south-central Alaska for 8 years before I realized some missing persons cases follow patterns that defy natural explanation. Working in the vast wilderness that defines Alaska is as dangerous as it is beautiful, and the two components often overlap. The state is home to some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth, where thousands of people venture each year seeking adventure, solace, or simply the freedom of untamed wilderness. For every person who returns unchanged from their journeys, someone does not return at all. They disappear in the wild and are never found, joining the thousands of others who have vanished into the vastness of Alaska, leaving behind nothing but questions and grief. The official statistics are staggering. Nearly 4,000 people go missing in Alaska annually, far more than any other state in the country. Some of those people return home safely, found wandering lost but unharmed. Some are recovered by search teams after brief separations, but a significant percentage of those who go missing are never heard from again. The wilderness swallows them whole, leaving no trace, no clue, nothing to suggest where they have gone. For me, the coordinator of search and rescue missions throughout south-central Alaska, those numbers were not just statistics. They were families sitting in my office, desperate eyes staring out at me, begging me to find their loved ones, begging me to bring them home. The search that changed me began on a Tuesday evening in late July, a time when the south-central region is usually swarming with tourists, enjoying the endless summer days and the region's reputation for stunning scenery. A call came through dispatch around 7:30 p.m. from a worried wife whose husband had not returned from a day hike along the East Fork River Trail. Mark Stevens was described as an experienced hiker who should have been back at their campsite no later than 5 p.m. His wife, Sharon, had waited until well after dusk before becoming truly concerned. When she tried to contact him via a satellite phone, the call failed to go through. She thought perhaps the battery had died, or he had lost signal temporarily. But when midnight came and went without any sign of him, she knew something was wrong. By 1 a.m., when Sharon radioed for help, my team was assembled and ready to deploy. We had a grid search pattern established within 45 minutes, and by 2:30 a.m., our search dogs and human teams were moving through the forest along the marked route Mark had intended to follow. The conditions were ideal for a search. The night was clear and cool, the air rich with the scent of spruce and pine. There was no indication of any recent storms that might have disrupted our trail, no signs of wildlife activity that might have deterred Mark from taking standard safety precautions. The trail itself was well worn, frequently traveled by hikers at all skill levels. Conditions, in short, were normal. By morning, with no signs of Mark anywhere along the trail, we began to spread our grid patterns wider, moving deeper into the forest and farther afield. We found his hat first, lying on the ground next to the river, about 100 yards north of the marked trail. His walking stick was next, lying on its side near a massive spruce tree about 150 yards beyond where we found the hat. His backpack was found downstream another 200 yards, snagged on branches near the water's edge. None of the items showed signs of disturbance. They were not scattered like they might have been if something had attacked him. They were placed, abandoned, left behind as if put down carefully instead of dropped in panic. His footprints led away from the marked trail into the thick forest understory. Our tracker followed them for what felt like miles through terrain that became increasingly difficult to navigate. The footprints stopped suddenly in a clearing surrounded by thick spruce trees. The ground showed no signs of struggle. No scuff marks, no disturbance of moss or underbrush. Just footprints that stopped mid-stride, and then nothing. The next morning, when dawn broke, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush and the tracks that ended without explanation, our tracker, a man named William, who had worked for the Park Service for over 20 years and had never seen anything like this, simply turned to me and said, "Someone is taking them." Over the next week, we searched 75 square miles of forest. We brought in additional teams from neighboring parks. We deployed helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras. We worked in shifts around the clock in 12-hour rotations, searching every inch of forest, every stream bed, every open space. We found nothing. No mark, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything violent had occurred. He was just gone, vanished. As if he had simply ceased to exist at some point along that trail. When we finally called off the search after 10 days without any new developments, I went home feeling more defeated than I had ever felt before. Mark's wife stayed behind, refusing to leave Anchorage, where she had come to believe her husband was still alive and would return soon. We had lost hikers before. We had found bodies that had been there for weeks, months, even years. That was the reality of working search and rescue in such harsh wilderness. But this was different. Something about Mark's disappearance felt wrong. The footprints that stopped, the items left behind so carefully arranged. It all pointed to a pattern we did not yet understand. 3 weeks after Mark disappeared, we received a call about another missing hiker, this time a young woman named Sarah Johnston, who had gone missing on the trail system connecting Gold Creek to the Talkeetna Mountains. Her family reported her missing after she failed to return from an overnight camping trip she had planned with friends, but at the last minute decided to do alone. The similarities between her disappearance and Mark's case were startling. Like Mark, she had been an experienced hiker. Like Mark, her belongings were found in neat piles along the trail instead of scattered like they might have been if something had attacked her. Like Mark, her footprints stopped mid-stride in a small clearing, leading absolutely nowhere. Like Mark, she simply disappeared. Over the next 2 months, as summer became fall and temperatures began their rapid descent toward winter, more cases came forward. Each one followed the same pattern. An experienced hiker going missing during what should have been a routine day trip. Each one leaving behind a perfectly intact campsite. Each one wearing proper gear, carrying proper supplies. No one injured on the trail before going missing. No one showing signs of dehydration, starvation, or exhaustion. We started mapping the locations where each disappearance occurred, working with local law enforcement agencies and the FBI to try and establish some kind of connection between the cases. The pattern emerged slowly at first, but became more apparent as we connected the cases. Each victim disappeared near points along the trail system where small tributaries joined the main waterways. Small creeks mostly, barely more than streams where water trickled through rock and brush. The bodies that were eventually found, months or sometimes years later, were always discovered downstream from where they disappeared, almost as if they had been placed in the water and allowed to drift. The pathologist who examined the remains found that they had been placed in the water shortly after death, indicating that whatever happened to these people, it happened quickly, cleanly, without prolonged violence. With each new case, I could feel the fear spreading through our community like a disease. People began to leave certain trails untraversed. Campsites that had previously been popular became avoided, their fire rings cold and unused, as people chose instead to congregate in more well-maintained areas, closer to civilized areas where phones worked and help was nearby. As fall transitioned into early winter, making searches increasingly difficult due to weather conditions, I knew we would have to pursue a different strategy. We needed to understand what was happening, not just respond to it after it occurred. With this in mind, I established a task force consisting of park rangers, search and rescue personnel, FBI agents, and experienced wilderness experts. We analyzed every available piece of data from all the disappearances. We mapped out trails, looking for connection points, potential corridors, or places where multiple streams and waterways intersected. We studied topographical charts, hoping to find underground formations or cave systems that might be connected to these tributaries. We studied satellite photos, looking for signs of man-made structures hidden beneath dense forest. Canopies. We listened to recordings made by those whose missing loved ones had carried satellite phones. We reviewed satellite tracking data from devices hikers had been wearing when they disappeared. The breakthrough came when we began examining the chemistry of the water in these tributary systems. The FBI chemical analysis expert working with us determined that the water in several of these streams showed traces of substances commonly used in pharmaceutical research laboratories. The concentrations were too low to be significant by themselves, but when mapped against the locations where people had disappeared, a clear pattern emerged. Something was flowing into these streams, something that came from underground through fissures or natural channels, something that was attracting people to them before their disappearances occurred. We deployed underwater drones into each of these tributary systems, starting with the smallest and working our way up the system to the main river channels. The drones mapped the underwater terrain, revealing cave systems where water flowed from one connected stream to the next underground through intricate networks of passages too small for humans to pass through. At points where the streams widened or slowed down, we found what looked like man-made openings into these caves, small tunnels excavated into hillsides, cleverly hidden beneath fallen logs or brush or water, their entrances disguised by the natural terrain. We mapped out the entire system over 6 weeks. We spent countless hours in our offices analyzing video footage from the drones, marking each potential entrance point with bright green pins on a giant wall map that dominated one entire wall of our operations center. We studied each video segment, marking coordinates, angles, elevations, anything that might help us determine which entry points were actually used by whoever was operating this underground network. By the beginning of December, we had identified 6 different primary entry points where trails intersected with these tributary systems. We sealed all entry points using industrial-strength cement mixed with metal composite materials designed to strengthen underground structures and prevent erosion. We covered each entry point with artificial camouflage, carefully matched to the surrounding terrain using materials developed for military applications. We disguised each site further with natural elements carefully placed to blend completely into the environment. We made them disappear completely into the landscape. On a Thursday evening, exactly 3 days after we sealed the last entry point, the calls began to flow in again. First, it was a family camping on Gold Creek who reported that their 8-year-old son had disappeared from their campsite while they were preparing dinner. Next, it was a group of hikers from Seattle who had been hiking the East Fork River Trail but never returned their rental gear from Anchorage before their scheduled return flights. They too were reported missing by their rental gear provider after no contact from them for nearly 8 hours beyond their scheduled return time. The reports kept coming through the night. By morning, we had over 50 people reported missing. Families were arriving at emergency shelters, and information posts established through various assistance networks, at rest stops along the trails and tributaries. Children were separated from their parents. Elderly people had gone on short walks looking for items and never returned. People had been reported missing from their campsites after stepping aside to use the restroom. Each report followed identical patterns. Every victim had disappeared during daylight hours, during what should have been simple activities, with no indication of any warning signs before their disappearance. On the morning of the 12th day since the first reports had begun, I sat in my office staring at that massive map on the wall. The green pins marked where our artificial entry points had been constructed. 100 new pink pins showed where people had disappeared since we sealed those access points. On the couch across from me sat Sharon Stevens, Mark's wife. She had been living out of her truck near the entrance of the park these past months, venturing out occasionally to visit churches or community centers where information was being shared among families of the missing people. She had become fierce in her belief that her husband was still alive somewhere, still lost in some hidden part of the park system, waiting for someone, for her, to find him. She had been here the whole time, watching us work through every detail of these cases. During these months, she had listened intently as we discussed ideas about underground channels, where water was flowing from one stream to another, through passageways small enough that they could never be discovered, except by divers equipped with underwater cameras and satellite communication tools. She had heard me theorize about pockets where methane gas escaping through fissures along water systems was attracting attention and possibly danger from local wildlife species sensitive to high concentrations of inorganic gases escaping underground and migrating through streams via natural means. She had listened intently while we pieced together theories about complex underground cave systems used by predators to move swiftly above ground, or move their victims, as easily as someone walking down any well-worn city street above ground. Sharon stood up and approached me slowly. Her face was pale against eyes dark from many nights of fitful sleep filled with worry and terror about her missing husband. She moved closer until we were nearly eye to eye, then turned to face the giant wall map across from us. Each green pin carefully positioned over our entrance points, sealing off potential movement beneath those artificial trails we thought we had discovered. For several minutes, neither of us moved or spoke. We just stood there staring at those pins, covering every possible access point we could find connecting water sources to underground tunnels capable of allowing human traffic. She finally broke the silence by asking me question most press reporters who covered park crimes asked at some point along investigations. Do you believe he is alive? I took a long, deep breath before responding, I have no idea. After several minutes pass, she seems resigned, as if she understands she will never know for sure where her husband went, or whether he is alive somewhere in some hidden part of this vast wilderness waiting for someone, for her, to find him. You think they are still out there, the people who are doing this, don't you? Yes. They will get him before we do. Probably. Will they kill him? No. Why not? She nods slowly, once then retreats away toward exit doors at opposite end where hallway leads toward parking lot, where her rental truck waits filled with clothes and supplies for indefinite stay until husband returns home safe and sound, or until they find his body buried beneath layers containing remnants originating from digestive systems capable of dissolving everything except bones, which gradually decay, rendering even skeletal remains unrecognizable, given enough time underwater where microorganisms flourish despite lax sunlight needed for photosynthesis by organisms other than those adapted live, perpetually dark aquatic environments, otherwise known as chemosynthesis. By morning, nearly 20 more reports arrived, confirming continued abductions along marked trails still free from human obstruction or artificial structure, obstructing direct passage beneath dense forestation where predators roam freely, unimpeded by human interaction or artificial barriers designed prevent any living organism capable travel routes unknown, except possibly those directly aware. Such possibilities exist on perpetual basis, given modern technological advances, allowing satellite transmissions directly from orbiting spacecraft thousands of miles above Earth. Capable provide live feeds, revealing precise coordinates within several yards, regardless distance from primary reference points established by governments around globe, requiring continuous active transmission protocols rather than passive reception modes. Typical, those lacking dual-purpose applications, allowing simultaneous broadcast receive capabilities currently limited. Only direct line-sight considerations, given atmospheric conditions present within zone affected most adversely. Electromagnetic interference generated both naturally, solar activity, artificially, radio transmission towers. I analyzed evidence for the Alaska State Crime Lab for 12 years before I heard the recordings from the Girdwood case. Some sounds should not be possible to record because the people making them have been dead for decades. Working in audio forensics requires a particular kind of mindset, one that accepts the technical and rejects the supernatural, while simultaneously acknowledging that the human voice can capture truths that no visual medium ever could. The voice contains everything about a person: fear, deception, truth, malice, desperation. All of it flows through vocal cords and emerges as sound that can be captured, preserved, and analyzed. For 12 years, I listened to voices, confessions recorded by police interrogations, threats left on answering machines, final words captured on 911 calls. Everything that humans said to each other in moments of crisis or confession. I heard it, analyzed it, filed it away in databases organized by frequency, pitch, timbre, and pattern recognition algorithms sophisticated enough to match voices across different recordings made years or sometimes decades apart. The Girdwood case arrived on my desk on a Tuesday morning in October 2019. A hiker had recovered what appeared to be a damaged digital camera along a rarely used trail in the Chugach Mountains, above the small ski town of Girdwood. The camera had been exposed to weather for an indeterminate amount of time, but miraculously, the internal storage still contained data, video files, audio files. The camera belonged to a missing person named David Chen, who had disappeared during a solo hiking trip in March of that year. His family had reported him missing after he failed to return from a weekend excursion, and despite search and rescue efforts that lasted nearly a month, he had never been located. The recovery of his camera 2 years later sparked renewed interest in the case, and the police requested my analysis of the audio contained in the video files. I began processing the files immediately. The camera contained 4 separate video recordings, each lasting between 15 and 23 minutes. The quality was degraded by water exposure and time, but the audio track was largely intact. I extracted the audio from each video and began analyzing the voice patterns captured in the recordings. What I found disturbed me immediately. The recordings contained conversations between multiple people, speaking in voices I could compare against archived recordings from previous police investigations in Alaska. I recognized several of those voices instantly. One voice belonged to a woman named Rachel Morrison, who had disappeared from an Anchorage parking lot in 1996. Another voice matched recordings from a missing persons case dating back to 2003. A third voice matched a missing person from 2007. The audio was clear enough that I could make out words, conversations, discussions about survival, about being lost, about not knowing how long they had been in wherever they were being held. They were speaking as if they were alive at the time the recording was made, as if they were conscious and aware and present in that moment when David Chen had been recording audio with his camera. I brought my findings to Detective Sarah Mills, who had been assigned to oversee the Girdwood investigation. I told her that I had identified voices in the recordings that matched missing persons cases spanning nearly 25 years. I told her that the voices were recent, contemporary to the time David Chen had been missing, which would place them occurring in early 2019. I told her that these voices belonged to people who had disappeared between 1994 and 2017. Most of them were presumed dead. Several had been officially declared dead by the courts after legal proceedings determined they were almost certainly not coming back alive. Mills listened to portions of the recordings herself, her expression growing darker with each voice she heard. She requested additional analysis. I performed voice matching using spectral analysis, comparing the voices in the recordings to archived samples from police interviews, 911 calls, family voicemails, anything that could provide a reference point. In 7 separate cases, I achieved matching confidence levels above 95%. The voices were real. They belonged to people who had disappeared years ago, and they were speaking in present tense as if they were alive during the time David Chen's camera was recording them. Mills assembled a task force to investigate further. We worked with specialists to determine if the audio had been manipulated, if archived recordings had been cleverly edited and spliced together to create an illusion of present voices speaking from the past. The analysis was conclusive. The audio was continuous, unedited, showing no signs of digital manipulation. The background noise was consistent throughout each recording, suggesting all voices were present in the same physical location at the same time. The environmental audio, wind sounds, water movement, occasional animal calls, all matched what would be expected from a location in the Chugach Mountains during early spring. The investigation expanded rapidly. Mills brought in the FBI and requested assistance from specialists in audio forensics who had worked on other high-profile cases. They conducted their own analyses and confirmed my findings. The voices were real. They had not been edited or manipulated. They belonged to missing persons. They were speaking in real time as if they were alive. Then came the most disturbing discovery. The timestamps embedded in the video files indicated they had been recorded on March 11, 2019, the day David Chen went missing. But the calendar date in the recording, visible briefly on a timestamp displayed in the video itself, showed March 11th, but the year read 2005. The video had been recorded twice, once in 2005 and again in 2019, or neither date was correct, or both were correct simultaneously. The technical team examining the camera's internal clock found it was set to 2005, suggesting that whoever had been recording video with the camera had set it to a date that was 14 years in the past. I spent weeks analyzing those recordings, listening to the voices, documenting every word, transcribing conversations that ranged from lucid discussions about their situation to confused ramblings about time and location. One voice, belonging to Rachel Morrison, spoke repeatedly about the number 2005, saying over and over that it was 2005, that she did not understand how it could be 2005 when she knew she had disappeared in 1996. Another voice, belonging to a man named Michael Kessler, who had disappeared in 2001, kept asking if anyone else could see what was happening, asking if anyone else understood that they were not where they should be. Mills brought in specialists in memory disorders and psychology to analyze the recordings. They noted signs of extreme psychological trauma, disorientation, confusion about time and place. The voices were coherent enough to communicate, but clearly belonged to people who had experienced significant cognitive and psychological deterioration. Several of the voices expressed thoughts of suicide. Some spoke of having been in the location for a very long time. Others seemed to have no memory of how they arrived or how long they had been there. One voice, belonging to a woman named Christine Harris, who disappeared in 1999, described what sounded like a cave or underground space where time seemed to move differently, where she could not tell day from night, where voices from the past seemed to echo from the walls around her. The camera had been found near a rock formation that showed signs of recent disturbance. Excavation revealed the entrance to a small cave system that had been deliberately sealed many years prior, using concrete and metal barriers. When the barriers were removed, we found an underground chamber. The chamber was empty of people, empty of any signs of recent habitation, but the walls were covered with names. Carved into the stone, dozens of names, hundreds of names, names and dates spanning back to the 1940s. Missing persons names, historical disappearances from across Alaska. People who had been lost to the wilderness for decades were memorialized on these stone walls. The investigation into the Girdwood Cave system eventually led to the identification of a man named Dr. Harold Finch, who had been a geology professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks from 1975 until his death in 2011. Finch had published numerous papers about the cave systems in the Chugach Mountains. His research had been extensive, detailed, showing an almost obsessive interest in mapping underground passages and caverns. He had died of natural causes in 2011, decades before the recordings were made, but his connection to the locations where people had disappeared was undeniable. The theory that emerged was disturbing. Finch had not been working alone. Someone had continued his work after his death. Someone had been luring people into the cave systems and holding them in underground chambers where they slowly deteriorated psychologically and physically, where they existed in a time that seemed separate from the normal world. The recordings David Chen had captured suggested that multiple victims were being held in the same location, existing together in some kind of temporal pocket where time moved differently than it did outside. But all of this raises more questions than answers. How was the camera recording voices from people who had been missing for years? How could missing persons from 1996, 2001, 1999 all be speaking at the same time in 2019 from what appeared to be the same location? How could the camera's clock be set to 2005? And yet the video files show a creation date of 2019. The official investigation concluded that the audio must have been manipulated somehow, that the camera had captured archived recordings of missing persons and presented them in a way that created an illusion of present voices speaking from the past. But I listened to those recordings hundreds of times. I analyzed every frequency, every harmonic, every acoustic property. The audio was not manipulated. It was real. It was genuine. It was impossible, but it was real. The cave system was sealed permanently using industrial-grade concrete. The interior was photographed extensively, and the names carved into the walls were documented and cross-referenced with missing persons cases. Of the 247 names documented, 189 matched actual disappearance cases. The remaining 58 could not be identified. Whether they represented other victims or were simply fictional names carved by someone with an obsessive interest in disappearances, the investigation could not determine. I left my job at the crime lab in 2020. I could not continue listening to voice recordings, knowing that some of them came from a place where time did not work the way it was supposed to. I could not analyze audio files without wondering if somewhere, in some underground cave system, more people were speaking their final words into the darkness, their voices being captured on some recording device that would eventually be discovered years or decades later, long after they had stopped speaking, long after they had ceased to exist in any form that the living world could comprehend. The recordings from David Chen's camera are archived in the secure facility at the Alaska State Crime Lab. They have been analyzed by dozens of specialists. No one has been able to explain them. No perpetrator has been identified or apprehended. The cave system in Girdwood remains sealed, and officially, the investigation is classified as unsolved. But I know what I heard in those recordings. I know that those voices were real. And I know that somewhere in Alaska, beneath the mountains and the forests, there are places where time does not flow the way it should, where missing persons exist in states that defy explanation, speaking words that echo across decades until finally, accidentally, someone finds the recording and the world briefly discovers what has been happening in the darkness all along. I investigated homicides in Kodiak for 16 years before I retired in 2018. Last month, someone mailed me evidence from my oldest unsolved case. The postmark showed it was sent from inside the police station. Retirement from law enforcement is a peculiar thing. After years of waking up each morning knowing that somewhere in the world a killer was still walking free, after years of seeing the worst humanity has to offer, and trying to make sense of crimes that defied all logic, the transition to life where you are no longer responsible for those things can be both liberating and haunting. I should have been golfing in Florida, sitting on beaches, watching sunsets from retirement communities filled with people who had never seen the things I had seen. Instead, I found myself back in Kodiak, the place I had sworn I would never return to once I turned in my badge. Kodiak is beautiful. That is the first thing anyone who visits will tell you. It is one of those places where the air feels purer, where the sky stretches wider than it does anywhere else, where mountains rise from the ocean like giants frozen in time. It is where thousands of salmon spawn in rivers so full of life they seem to pulse with a purpose all their own. It is where bears fish in streams, their massive forms effortlessly catching silver bodies that fight and struggle against their fate. It is where you can stand on a rocky outcrop and watch whales breach the surface of the Pacific, their presence ancient and otherworldly. It is also, as I discovered early in my career, where some of the darkest crimes imaginable take place, where isolation breeds a special kind of desperation, and where nothing can hide what you have done when there is nowhere left to run. The first letter arrived in a plain brown envelope with no return address and Anchorage postmark. Inside was a stack of photographs, 14 in total. Black and white pictures of a woman I did not recognize. She was in her mid-20s, long dark hair falling around her shoulders, laughing at the camera in one image as if she had not a care in the world. In others, she sat quietly at what looked like a bar, holding a cigarette, her face half turned away. In one image, she was staring directly into the camera with a strange expression, as though daring whoever was holding it to take her picture. There was no note with the photographs, nothing to explain who she was or why her pictures were being sent to me all these years after my retirement. The next day, another envelope arrived. This one contained a transcript of an interrogation. The statement belonged to a man named Peter Harris, dated August 15, 1996, nearly 22 years before to the day I received the photographs. Peter had been arrested in July of that year after being caught breaking into a home in downtown Kodiak. In the course of questioning him about the burglary, detectives had discovered that the home belonged to a woman named Claudia Marsh, a woman who had been reported missing 2 months earlier. Peter Harris had confessed to taking Claudia's house keys during a chance encounter outside her workplace and returning later to rob her home in the middle of the afternoon while she was working. The interrogation transcript showed that Peter had been nervous, rambling, his statements inconsistent and contradictory. What caught my attention was not the burglary itself or Peter's confession to it. It was one line halfway through the transcript. "I swear I don't know what happened to Claudia. I didn't take anything else from that house except her keys. If someone did something to her, I don't know anything about it." The statement had been written off as irrelevant at the time, dismissed as the ramblings of a man desperate to convince police he had nothing to do with a missing persons case. When Claudia's body was found 5 months later, partially consumed by wildlife in a rocky ravine outside town, the case had been classified as an accidental death by exposure. No suspects were ever identified. No investigation was ever launched. Her death was attributed to hypothermia, likely brought on by wandering in the wrong direction during one of Kodiak's sudden storms. The investigation was closed within days of her body being identified. I spent 3 days reviewing every file related to the case. I pulled medical examiner reports, criminal history checks on anyone with a connection to Claudia or the neighborhood where she lived and worked. I asked neighbors about her relationships, her activities, her comings and goings in the months leading up to her disappearance. What I discovered was that Claudia Marsh, a 28-year-old dental hygienist, had lived quietly and contentedly with no known enemies or volatile relationships or suspicious connections. Her bank records showed routine spending patterns. Her social media displayed nothing out of the ordinary. She had attended a friend's wedding on the day before her disappearance, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses. No one remembered anything unusual about her during that time. No arguments were reported between her and anyone attending the wedding. Her behavior was described as happy and relaxed. She seemed to everyone around her to be enjoying a typical evening out before what was supposed to have been a typical day at work. The medical examiner's report placed her time of death within 72 hours of her body being discovered. She had not had a meal in approximately 8 hours before she died. Analysis of her stomach contents confirmed what pathologists usually see in cases of death by exposure. Nothing. No sign of struggle evident on her body. No trauma to her hands, arms, or legs to indicate she had fought anyone. No defense wounds. Her broken ankle showed that she had fallen from a height of at least 15 feet onto sharp rocks that had pierced through her clothing, severing tendons, tearing skin, breaking bone. DNA under her fingernails belonged to her. Blood alcohol level was 0.04%. A toxicology screen detected traces of sedatives common to dental offices, prescribed medications for anxiety and depression she had been taking since 2005. All details pointed conclusively to a tragic yet unremarkable ending. But something about this case had stuck with me since 1996. Something had bothered me since the first time I spoke with Claudia's parents, her co-workers, her friends. She had not been someone prone to poor decision-making or risk-taking. She had not been someone who wandered off trails or ventured into dangerous places without knowing where she was going or what she was doing. She was not someone who got lost walking home from work at 4 p.m. during the middle of the day. She had left her office that afternoon as though everything in the world was normal, as though nothing unusual was brewing beneath the surface of her mundane life. Yet somehow, within hours of walking home from work, she had fallen to her death in a place no one would ever find her on purpose. 7 days passed between receiving that first envelope containing photographs and now 7 days. On the 8th day, I received a third envelope containing what appeared to be a copy of a police report filed against Peter Harris by a woman named Karen Jameson in September 1995. In her statement, Karen described being followed by a man matching Peter Harris's description as she walked home from school late one night in 1995. She told officers she had noticed someone watching her from across the street from the apartment building where she lived with her parents. She had pretended not to notice him at first and continued on her way, but when she turned to unlock her door, she realized he was standing directly behind her. He had forced himself inside behind her just enough for the door to lock behind them both before she screamed loud enough to wake her parents on the 3rd floor. He fled when her parents came rushing downstairs with a baseball bat in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Karen identified Peter Harris in a photo lineup 2 days later. When officers went to Peter's place of employment to bring him in for questioning, they found he had quit his job the day before and was nowhere to be found in town. He had vanished without a trace. His belongings were still in his apartment. His car was still parked in his garage. The landlord said he had left an envelope with cash payment for the next month's rent on his kitchen table, with a note saying he had decided to travel for a while, but would be back before his lease expired in October. He never returned. Kodiak police opened an investigation and issued an arrest warrant for breaking and entering, and attempted kidnapping charges related to the Karen Jamison incident. But he was never caught. Peter Harris remains at large to this day. Another day passed. A seventh envelope arrived with no postmark and no return address. Inside were two yellowed newspaper clippings from the Anchorage Daily News dated March 1995. The first had been torn in half, leaving only a partial headline visible. The rest of the article was missing. The second article focused on a local politician accused of rape during an overnight business trip to Seattle. The man had confessed under pressure from detectives interrogating him at the police station late one night after his victim finally came forward with her story of assault to her family members. When she confronted him, he had broken down, crying, dropping to his knees, begging for forgiveness, claiming it had been an accident. He had never meant to hurt anyone. He had been drinking heavily that night and could not remember what happened after he woke up next morning, next to her on the bed, where she had said no over and over again, but was not strong enough to stop him from pushing his hands into her hair and pulling her back towards him until she lay limp against the bedspread, praying for it to be over so she could crawl away and escape this man who called himself her friend. A ninth envelope arrived 2 days ago, this one containing a new photograph of Peter Harris. It was an 8x10 portrait taken in prison. He looked exactly the same after 22 years behind bars. Thinning hair, an unkempt beard that reached nearly to his chest, eyes cold and empty as ever. The only difference in his appearance was that now he wore the orange jumpsuit of someone serving life without parole in the Arizona state prison system for multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and murder involving young women across several states dating back to 1995. The photograph had been accompanied by an article from the Phoenix Tribune detailing his sentencing, which was handed down by Judge Marvin Myers after a jury of 7 men and 5 women found him guilty of abducting 6 young women from various parks and shopping centers over a period spanning 20 years while he lived under an assumed name in Phoenix, Arizona. That is when I realized what had been sent to me so meticulously over these past 2 weeks. What I initially believed to be random clippings were, in fact, a deliberate reconstruction of an investigation into Claudia Marsh's disappearance that had never happened. The person mailing these to me was laying out a case against Peter Harris for her murder, step by step and piece by piece, using archived clippings from other cases involving him. Clippings from earlier investigations Peter Harris had been connected with over 2 decades ago, before he began taking victims across state lines and vanishing each time as quickly as he would appear in their lives, unannounced but never forgotten by those left behind. I knew then what I had to do. I drove out of town early that morning along Kodiak's only road toward Bear Valley Trail, where my GPS showed coordinates leading to a remote campsite nestled deep into forest land 3 miles off paved road. When I arrived at sunrise 2 hours later, I found the campsite exactly as it had been described, but there was no sign of anyone else around. Everything lay untouched, like it had been left behind by visitors expecting to return any moment now but never did. No sign of struggle. No indication anyone else had been there recently, except tire tracks leading up dirt path, then disappearing behind dense fir trees, growing close together, obscuring any view of what lay deeper inside. As I stood alone, listening only birdsong, and wind-rustling leaves above my head beneath gray sky, threatening rain at any moment. Now I knew this would be where someone would finally find Claudia Marsh's remains. She would be lying under leaves, covered by branches broken beneath someone's weight, just days after her death. Days before, Peter Harris fled town, leaving everything behind except one single photograph tucked away inside police jacket pocket, containing all answers we needed to finally bring him home again after 22 years running free, without anyone ever suspecting how close he had been or how much he had taken from us all without being caught. Until now. This is how I knew, then with absolute certainty, what had been sent to me wasn't clippings from various investigations over 2 decades. They were breadcrumbs leading straight back toward Claudia Marsh herself. And everything else lay waiting beneath trees still standing tall today, just outside Kodiak's town limits, while rain fell gently down onto soil, covering her forever. I worked security along isolated sections of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline for 14 years. The 800-mile route passes through some of the most remote territory on Earth. That remoteness attracted something we were not trained to handle. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline is a marvel of engineering, a massive steel artery running from the North Slope oil fields near Prudhoe Bay in the Arctic down to the port city of Valdez on the southern coast. It crosses mountains, rivers, permafrost, and wilderness so vast that standing at certain points along its length, you can see nothing but untouched terrain extending in every direction until it reaches the curvature of the earth. I maintained security along a 60-mile section of pipe that ran through the Grayling Mountains, a region so isolated that the nearest town was 90 miles away and required a helicopter to reach reliably during winter months. My job was straightforward in theory. Monitor the pipeline for signs of tampering or unauthorized access, respond to maintenance alarms, verify that only authorized personnel had access to pump stations and valve complexes scattered along the route. In 14 years, I'd only had to respond to genuine incidents perhaps a dozen times. Most of the alarms were false, triggered by ice forming on sensors during winter or minor equipment malfunctions that resolved themselves. It was routine work, boring work, the kind of job that required constant vigilance but provided almost nothing to be vigilant about. That monotony ended in March 2016 when the alarms started going off at places they should never have gone off. The first incident involved a pump station located 47 miles north of my base. An unauthorized access alarm registered at 2:34 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The system showed someone had bypassed the electronic lock on the service entrance and had been inside the station for approximately 8 minutes before the alarm triggered. I radioed my supervisor in Anchorage, explained the situation, and received authorization to investigate. I drove my truck to the pump station in approximately 50 minutes, arriving to find everything locked and secure. No signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside. The service records showed the last authorized maintenance visit had been 12 days prior. I reviewed the security footage from the exterior cameras and saw nothing. The images showed an empty landscape, snow falling gently, the station standing alone in the darkness. At the exact timestamp when the alarm triggered internally, the exterior cameras showed no movement, no person, nothing approaching or leaving the facility. I contacted my supervisor again and reported the incident as a potential sensor malfunction. Maintenance teams were scheduled to inspect and calibrate the system. While waiting for them to arrive, I walked the perimeter of the station, checking fence lines, examining ground conditions for footprints, looking for anything that might explain an unauthorized entry where no physical evidence existed. Over the next 2 weeks, similar alarms were triggered at 3 additional pump stations, each one occurring between 2:00 a.m. and 3:00 a.m., each one showing no evidence of actual entry when I arrived to investigate. The exterior cameras recorded nothing. The ground showed no tracks. The facilities remained locked and undisturbed. My supervisor suggested I needed to accept that the system was simply malfunctioning, that perhaps atmospheric conditions or electromagnetic interference was causing false triggers. I wanted to believe him, but something about the pattern troubled me. The timing was too consistent. The locations were too strategic, positioned at intervals that made sense if someone was working systematically along the pipeline. Then the tunnel entrance appeared. I discovered it while responding to another alarm at a remote valve complex 58 miles north of my base. The alarm had triggered at 2:47 a.m., and when I arrived, I performed my standard inspection. As I walked the perimeter, My flashlight caught something I had never noticed before. A faint seam in the hillside, about 100 yards behind the valve complex. Upon closer examination, I found that what appeared to be natural rock face was actually a carefully constructed facade made of plywood and painted to blend with the surrounding stone. Behind the facade was an entrance, a tunnel carved into the hillside. A tunnel that led down into darkness. I radioed my supervisor immediately and reported what I had found. This time, the response was different. Within 24 hours, I had FBI agents and Department of Homeland Security officials on site conducting a full investigation. The tunnel was excavated and mapped. It ran underground for approximately 600 yards before terminating at what appeared to be a workshop of some kind. Inside the workshop, we found tools, equipment, and most alarmingly, a detailed map of the entire pipeline showing all pump stations, valve complexes, and vulnerable access points marked in red. The investigation expanded rapidly. Over the next month, searchers located 7 additional tunnel entrances positioned at strategic intervals along the pipeline route. Each tunnel was equipped with modern tools and electrical equipment. Each one showed signs of recent use. The implications became clear. Someone had been conducting a systematic study of the pipeline infrastructure, mapping access points, testing security systems, learning the patterns of maintenance crews and security personnel. They were preparing for something: a coordinated attack, a systematic sabotage, a plan so ambitious and terrifying that the entire U.S. energy infrastructure could be compromised. The FBI launched a massive investigation to identify who was behind the tunnel construction and unauthorized access attempts. They interviewed every pipeline maintenance worker, every contractor, every person with legitimate access to the facilities. They reviewed financial records looking for payments that might suggest foreign agents or domestic terrorists. They studied the engineering required to construct the tunnels, which was sophisticated enough to suggest someone with advanced knowledge of geology and construction. But despite all these efforts, they found no suspects, no evidence pointing to any specific individuals or organizations. Then they discovered the living spaces. Inside 3 of the tunnels, 40 yards or more below ground, were chambers that had been converted into habitations. Sleeping bags, water storage, food supplies, propane heaters. Evidence that someone had been living inside these underground spaces for extended periods. The most disturbing discovery was a journal found in one of the chambers. Written in careful handwriting, it documented observations and theories about the pipeline system, but it also contained disturbing personal observations. Notes about surveillance of security personnel like me. Details about our patterns, our routines, our vulnerabilities. The journal included descriptions of me specifically, my appearance, my vehicle, my habits, my approximate location at specific times of day. I was terrified. I was being watched by someone who had carved hidden tunnels beneath the ground, who had been living underground, observing me for months or possibly years. The FBI took my statement and assigned protective detail. My section of the pipeline was placed under heightened security with additional personnel deployed to vulnerable points. But whoever had been living in those tunnels and watching me was gone. All the chambers below ground were abandoned. No bodies were found. No evidence suggesting foul play, just empty chambers and detailed journals that proved someone had been observing this critical piece of infrastructure with the intent to either damage it or understand how to damage it. The official investigation was classified immediately. Details were heavily redacted. The tunnels were sealed using concrete and metal barriers designed to prevent any future access or excavation. My section of the pipeline was transferred to a higher security classification, and new monitoring systems were installed that were far more sophisticated than anything I had ever seen before. When my contract expired in 2019, the pipeline company offered to renew it, but I declined. I could not work knowing that beneath the ground around me, there might still be tunnels, still be observers, still be someone studying the infrastructure with intentions I could not comprehend. What I learned later, through former colleagues still working on the pipeline, was that similar tunnels had been discovered at other sections of the pipeline over the following years. Some were found as far south as the Copper River, over 300 miles away. Others were discovered pointing access points along the route where no tunnels had been found initially. The pattern suggested that whoever was behind this had been working on this project for years, possibly decades, with resources far beyond what any single individual could command. The tunnels were too sophisticated, the planning was too extensive, the level of surveillance was too comprehensive. No one was ever arrested for the tunnel construction. No organization ever claimed responsibility. The project simply stopped at some point, abandoned before completion, left behind like evidence of an enormous ambition that had been interrupted before it could reach fruition. Sometimes I drive past sections of pipeline and wonder what is still beneath the ground. What plans remain incomplete? What tunnels still exist undiscovered? What observers might still be watching, still studying, still preparing for a moment when the pipeline and everyone protecting it will be vulnerable to whatever they have been planning all along? The Trans-Alaska Pipeline continues to operate. Oil flows through those steel tubes every single day, traveling the entire 800-mile distance from the Arctic to the Pacific. But I will never forget standing in that tunnel, shining my flashlight into the darkness, realizing that someone had built this infrastructure specifically to study me, specifically to understand our security procedures, specifically to prepare for something terrible that we prevented by accident when I discovered the tunnel facade that had been carefully designed to remain hidden forever. I patrolled the Alaska Highway between Tok and the Canadian border for 9 years. That stretch of road sees maybe 20 vehicles a day in winter, but one rest stop kept showing fresh tire tracks every single morning, even when no cars had passed. The Alaska Highway is one of those roads that most people only experience in travel documentaries or extreme adventure shows. It runs 1,122 miles from British Columbia through Yukon Territory and into Alaska, connecting Dawson Creek to Delta Junction, through some of the most remote and unforgiving territory on the North American continent. The section I patrolled was the 260 miles between Tok and the Canadian border, a stretch that winds through boreal forest, crosses mountain passes, and passes through small communities so remote that most people have never heard of them. My job was straightforward: enforce traffic laws, respond to vehicle breakdowns, assist stranded travelers, and monitor rest stops and pullouts to ensure public safety. Most days involved long stretches of driving along empty highway with nothing but the forest on either side and the sky stretching endlessly ahead. The weather was variable and frequently brutal. Winter temperatures regularly dropped to -40 degrees. Summer brought mosquitoes so thick they could obscure your vision if you were not careful. The highway itself was maintained reasonably well during peak seasons, but winter travel was always a risk. People who drove that highway understood the stakes. You were many miles from help if something went wrong: a breakdown, an accident, an unexpected weather event. Any of these things could become life-threatening if you were not prepared. There was a rest stop located 47 miles north of Tok, a small pull-out area with a wooden outhouse, a picnic table, and a parking area big enough for 3 or 4 vehicles. Most people either skipped the rest stop or used it only during daylight hours when the likelihood of encountering bears or other wildlife was minimal. The stop was not well maintained by any standard. The outhouse was often frozen during winter, rendering it useless. The picnic table was weathered and splintered from years of exposure to harsh elements. The parking area was nothing more than an unmarked area where vegetation had been compressed by vehicle tires over many years until only bare dirt and gravel remained. I began noticing fresh tire tracks in that parking area during the winter of 2015. The pattern was unusual. The tracks appeared overnight despite the fact that the highway remained closed to through traffic during severe weather events. Sections of the Alaska Highway are closed during winter due to hazardous conditions, particularly mountain passes, where snowfall and winds combine to create conditions too dangerous for safe travel. When those closures were in effect, no vehicles should be using the rest stop. Yet every morning, new tire tracks appeared. I began documenting the phenomenon. Every morning, I would drive to the rest stop and photograph the parking area, measuring the depth of snow, comparing the tracks to the previous day, noting any patterns or variations. The tracks were always fresh, made within 12 hours of when I arrived to photograph them. The vehicles appeared to be mid-sized, likely SUVs or trucks based on the tire width and track pattern. Multiple vehicles were making visits, I determined after careful analysis of track patterns. At least 3 different vehicles based on tire size variations. I expanded my surveillance. I began driving to the rest stop multiple times per day, varying my arrival times, hoping to catch whoever was using the facility during closure periods. I brought night vision equipment and spent entire nights monitoring the parking area from a hidden location in the forest. Nothing. The vehicles seemed to arrive only when I was not present. The tracks told the story, but I never saw the vehicles or the people driving them. After 2 months of fruitless surveillance, I brought in additional officers and enlisted help from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who patrol the Canadian side of the border. We set up a more sophisticated monitoring system. Motion-activated cameras were placed at the rest stop, wired to send images to our patrol office. Trail cameras were positioned in the surrounding forest to capture any approach routes. We expected to finally catch whoever was using the rest stop illegally during highway closures. The equipment captured nothing useful. The cameras at the rest stop showed only empty parking areas. No vehicles appeared in any of the recorded footage. Yet the tire tracks continued to appear. Every morning, without fail, fresh tracks would be present. The tire patterns remained consistent with the previous weeks. Multiple vehicles, the same sizes, the same makes, visiting during the night hours when no human observer could see them. I began researching the history of that rest stop, wondering if there was something about the location that made it attractive to illegal activity. I discovered that the area had been used for bootlegging during Prohibition. Rumor had it that smugglers ran alcohol across the border through the Talk Gap, a mountain pass that provided direct access to the Yukon without going through official border crossings. The rest stop was located near that gap, suggesting perhaps the history of smuggling through the area had not ended. I coordinated with Customs and Border Protection agents to investigate whether the rest stop was being used for smuggling operations. They conducted surveillance of their own, focusing on the Canadian side of the border. They observed nothing during their monitoring periods. Yet the tire tracks continued to appear at the American side rest stop with metronomic regularity. Then I discovered something that changed my understanding of the situation entirely. One morning, instead of simply photographing the tire tracks, I followed them. The tracks did not simply arrive at the rest stop and leave. They extended from the parking area into the surrounding forest. I put on my snowshoes and followed the tracks, moving carefully through thick spruce and pine trees. The tracks led deeper into the forest, away from the highway, toward the mountains. I followed the tracks for 3 miles, 3 miles through wilderness. The trail led to a small valley hidden from the highway by a ridge of rock and dense forest. In the valley, I found something I was not prepared for. There was a small compound. 5 buildings arranged in a rough circle around a central area. The buildings appeared to be made from salvaged materials, plywood and metal siding, camouflaged with branches and snow. Tire tracks surrounded the compound, parking areas where multiple vehicles had been stationed. The whole operation was built to be invisible from the highway, accessed only through the narrow trail I had followed through the forest. I radioed for backup immediately and waited for additional officers to arrive. When they did, we approached the compound cautiously. The buildings appeared abandoned, no smoke rising from the chimneys. No signs of recent activity except for the tire tracks I had followed. We discovered the buildings were unlocked. Inside, we found evidence of habitation: sleeping bags, food supplies, a small kitchen area set up in one building, a workshop in another building containing tools and equipment. But what we found most disturbing was in the central building. Maps. Dozens of maps covering every wall. Maps of Alaska, maps of Canada, maps of the United States. Every map had been marked with locations, dates, times, and handwritten notes in a language I did not recognize. The level of detail was extraordinary. Specific locations were marked along the Alaska Highway. Rest stops, pullouts, sections of highway where visibility was limited or traffic was minimal. The FBI was contacted immediately. Within 24 hours, agents from multiple agencies descended on the compound. The buildings were fully excavated and documented. Evidence was collected and analyzed. What we eventually discovered was that the compound had been used for coordinating human trafficking operations across the Alaska-Canada border. The tire tracks at the rest stop represented transport runs, moving victims between collection points and staging areas. The maps indicated that over 40 different locations along the Alaska Highway and connecting routes had been used for trafficking operations. The handwritten notes in a Cyrillic script suggested Russian organized crime was behind the operation. The compound had been abandoned approximately 3 weeks before I discovered it, suggesting they had moved operations elsewhere after realizing someone was beginning to investigate the tire tracks. The investigation that followed was classified at levels I was not cleared to access. What I learned was limited to debriefings and official statements. Trafficking victims were eventually rescued from locations in Canada and Alaska. Criminal charges were filed against individuals allegedly connected to trafficking organizations, but no one was ever arrested at the compound I discovered. Whoever had been coordinating the operations had vanished. What haunts me most about this case is the tire tracks. Night after night, they appeared at that rest stop with perfect regularity. 3 miles of forest separated the rest stop from the compound, yet somehow the victims transported through those locations remained unnoticed. No one reported seeing anything unusual. No stranded travelers called for help from that isolated rest stop. The trafficking operation existed in plain sight, accessible from a highway that thousands of people drive every year, yet invisible to everyone except whoever was driving those vehicles in the darkness. The compound was eventually dismantled. The buildings were removed. The forest reclaimed the small valley. I still patrol that same section of highway. Every time I pass that rest stop, I examine the parking area carefully, looking for tire tracks that should not be there. Sometimes, during winter months when snow covers everything, I find fresh tracks again. Never the same pattern as before, never clear enough to follow with certainty, but enough to suggest that perhaps whoever operated from that compound was returning, waiting for the attention of law enforcement to diminish before resuming operations. The Alaska Highway stretches on endlessly. The rest stop stands waiting for the next traveler. And somewhere in the darkness between Tok and the Canadian border, tire tracks continue to appear on nights when no one is watching, when the highway is empty and the forest is silent, and the distance between help is measured in dangerous miles that no one traveling alone should have to traverse.